The British conquest of India did not begin as an invasion. It began as a commercial permission slip. In AD 1600, Queen Elizabeth I placed her seal on a royal charter granting a group of London merchants monopoly rights to trade into the East Indies. The name was almost absurd in its bureaucratic length. The Governor and Company of Merchants of London Trading into the East Indies. It sounded like ledgers, cargo, and polite petition. It sounded like commerce. It sounded harmless to a political world that believed sovereignty lived in crowns, parliaments, fortresses, and armies. But history is often most dangerous when power arrives dressed as administration. That charter was not merely a business license. It was a legal technology. It fused private capital to royal ambition. It allowed merchants to operate beneath the shadow of a sovereign without being identical to the sovereign. It converted distance into opportunity, risk into investment, and trade privilege into the first architecture of empire. The crown did not conquer India in AD 1600. It delegated a possibility. And over the next century and a half, that possibility learned to negotiate, fortify, bribe, spy, lend, tax, and kill. By AD 1757, at the Battle of Plassey, a private corporation would defeat the Nawab of Bengal not by brute force alone, but through a precise convergence of arms, conspiracy, finance, intelligence, and betrayal. By AD 1765, after the Diwani grant, that same corporation would acquire the right to collect revenue across Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. The threshold had been crossed. The company no longer merely traded in the wealth of India. It had entered the fiscal bloodstream of millions. Then, in AD 1858, after rebellion exposed the unbearable contradiction at the heart of company rule, the British state absorbed its Indian empire into the crown. The private empire was nationalized, not because it had failed to create power, but because it had created too much power with too little legitimacy. This is the paradox at the center of the story. A corporation became a territorial empire before the state fully understood what it had authorized. A balance sheet became a battlefield. A boardroom became a court. A trading post became a fort. A revenue office became the skeleton of sovereignty. A spreadsheet with cannons. The East India Company was not simply an episode of colonial greed, nor only a villain in a familiar imperial morality play. It was something colder, stranger, and more instructive. An institutional machine that revealed how sovereignty can migrate. Not always through revolution, not always through formal conquest, sometimes through usefulness, through dependency, through the outsourcing of functions too distant, too expensive, or too complex for the state to manage directly. That is why this story does not remain buried in the 18th century. The future may not produce another East India Company with red-coated officers, sepoy armies, and warehouses of silk, tea, and saltpeter. History rarely repeats itself in the same uniform. But the underlying pattern may return, the delegation of state capacity to a private coordination system. In the coming age of artificial general intelligence, the most powerful companies may not need to seize palaces or declare themselves governments. They may only need to become indispensable. Managing logistics better than ministries, detecting fraud better than tax agencies, allocating energy better than utilities, securing networks better than armies, mediating disputes faster than courts, and keeping food, money, information, identity, and infrastructure moving when older institutions stall. If a chartered company once turned trade into sovereignty, could an AGI company turn coordination into rule? This is not prophecy. It is a historical question sharpened against the future. I am Professor Adrian Lockwell, and this is Archives of Humanity. To understand what may be coming, the chessboard must first be reconstructed from AD 1600 onward, when a crown seeking reach without full responsibility created a commercial instrument that would one day outgrow the hand that signed it. The first move on this chessboard was not a fleet, not a fortress, not a battlefield. It was a document. In AD 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to the Governor and Company of Merchants of London Trading into the East Indies. Inside that long, legalistic title stood one of the most consequential institutional inventions of the early modern world. A private corporation carrying public authority. The charter gave English merchants monopoly rights to trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Straits of Magellan. In effect, the crown drew a vast commercial arc across the globe and declared that, within it, no other English competitor would be recognized. This was not routine paperwork. It was a weaponized legal instrument. The English state in AD 1600 possessed ambition far beyond its administrative muscles. It had maritime energy, Protestant confidence, and a hunger to challenge Iberian and Dutch power, but it did not yet have the bureaucratic machinery of a mature world empire. Direct rule across oceans required ships, soldiers, translators, intelligence, credit, legal systems, and permanent officials. It required the ability to survive distance. England could imagine global reach before it could actually govern globally. The chartered company solved that problem with brutal elegance. It allowed the state to outsource ambition while privatizing risk. Investors would raise the capital. Merchants would absorb the losses. Captains would test dangerous routes. Agents would plead, bargain, bribe, and negotiate before foreign courts. If the venture failed, the disaster belonged largely to private men. If it succeeded, the crown gained influence, information, revenue, and strategic presence without immediately constructing an imperial bureaucracy. Here lies the first great irony of the story. European limitation produced the institutional improvisation that later enabled European domination. Because states could not yet rule the world directly, they licensed corporations to operate in the gaps where state capacity ended. And those licenses did not remain modest. Commercial privilege gradually accumulated the attributes of sovereignty. Chartered companies could fortify trading posts, defend cargo, maintain armed personnel, negotiate agreements, and in certain contexts exercise legal jurisdiction or coin money. These powers were not decorative additions. They were fragments of the state, delegated piece by piece to organizations designed for profit, competition, and survival. England was not alone in this experiment. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, chartered in AD 1602, became an even more formidable corporate sovereign rival. Backed by Dutch finance, naval discipline, and an aggressive pursuit of monopoly, the VOC could wage war, make treaties, seize territory, and discipline trade networks across the Indonesian archipelago and beyond. The English company entered a world where European corporations were already learning to behave like states, not because they had abandoned commerce, but because commerce at that distance required coercion, diplomacy, intelligence, and law. Yet European rivalry should never be mistaken for European mastery. In the early 17th century, the Indian Ocean world was not an empty arena awaiting Western command. Asian commercial systems were older, wealthier, and more intricate than the Atlantic intruders who arrived at their edges. English merchants came as petitioners, not rulers. They needed permissions, farmans, customs concessions, safe conducts, and protection from powers that already possessed the ports, the markets, the tax systems, and the political legitimacy. Nowhere was this clearer than in India. Mughal India was not a passive prize. It was one of the richest imperial systems on earth, sustained by dense revenue administration, vast agricultural output, powerful cities, and textile industries that drew silver from across continents. Bengal, Gujarat, and the Coromandel coast were not peripheral theaters. They were engines of global commerce. The company's first role, then, was not conqueror. It was interface, between London capital and Asian production, between royal charters and imperial permissions, between oceanic violence and courtly negotiation. But an interface can become a gatekeeper. A gatekeeper can become a broker. And in a fractured political world, a broker can become something far more dangerous. The legal shell alone did not create empire. For that, the company needed pressure points. Rival courts, anxious bankers, military entrepreneurs, succession crises, and the slow weakening of the imperial order that had once kept foreign merchants in their place. A royal charter could authorize ambition, but it could not defend a coastline. The dangerous genius of the East India Company emerged in what it built behind that legal permission. Not a normal merchant firm, but a working machine of power. Its early factories were not factories in the industrial sense. They were trading stations, warehouses, counting houses, diplomatic listening posts, and small islands of corporate authority embedded inside vast Asian commercial systems. Surat, Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta began as points of exchange, where textiles, spices, bullion, credit, and contracts moved through the hands of clerks and brokers. Yet trade in the 17th and 18th centuries was never merely trade. It existed inside a world of armed rivals, fragile permissions, maritime war, court politics, and sudden reversals of fortune. A European war could become an Indian Ocean crisis when a single ship arrived with new orders from London, Amsterdam, or Paris. So the warehouse acquired walls. The walls acquired guns. The guns required men. In Calcutta, Fort William became more than a defensive structure. It became a signal that commerce had begun to speak in the grammar of sovereignty. Trade required forts. Forts required soldiers. Soldiers required revenue. At first, the company's armed force could be described as protection. Guards for warehouses, garrisons for settlements, convoy security for ships and goods. But institutions do not evolve according to their founding myths. They evolve according to incentives. A guard force became a political lever. A garrison became a bargaining chip. A bargaining chip became an army. The company increasingly relied on Indian sepoys commanded by European officers, producing a military instrument that was neither simply a British state army nor a local princely force. It was corporate violence. Paid, disciplined, portable, and justified in the language of security. That distinction matters. The company did not need to be all-powerful. It needed to be useful, armed, liquid, and present at the exact moment when others needed money, protection, or mediation. Its logistics connected London capital, Asian goods, Indian revenues, maritime insurance, military payrolls, and political favors. Capital financed trade. Trade created credit. Credit sustained influence. Influence opened revenue. Revenue paid soldiers. Soldiers protected the system that generated more revenue. No single mastermind had to design the whole machine. Expansion could arise from ambition, fear, delay, corruption, and improvisation acting together. This is why the company should not be mistaken for an omniscient empire in embryo. It stumbled constantly. Directors in London governed through slow correspondence, partial reports, and illusions of control. Their servants in India often pursued private fortunes with astonishing aggression, sometimes damaging the institution they served. Gifts, side deals, private trade, court influence, and personal enrichment were not marginal details. They were part of the machine's operating temperature. Corruption produced scandal, but it also produced knowledge. Greedy men discovered which ministers could be bought, which commanders felt insulted, which bankers feared instability, and which succession dispute could be turned into an opening. Information became the company's second army. Letters moved between presidencies and London. Resident agents watched rulers and ministers. Merchants carried rumors alongside invoices. Court informants converted personal rivalries into strategic intelligence. The company learned who owed money, who feared removal, who resented a rival, who wanted protection, and who could be promised advancement in exchange for betrayal. Finance became the third battlefield. Debt could weaken a court before cannon fire began. Credit could decide whether an army marched or dissolved. Banking families, revenue assignments, commercial privileges, and arrears of pay could be as decisive as artillery. In a political world dependent on cash flow, money was not merely wealth. Money was motion. Money was loyalty. Money was time purchased before an enemy could organize. Trade required forts. Forts required soldiers. Soldiers required revenue. Revenue required influence. Influence required information. And information, once converted into leverage, began to resemble rule. By the early 18th century, the company had become a hybrid creature. Merchant house, spy network, military contractor, diplomatic broker, credit engine, and fortified landlord. It had not yet conquered Bengal. It had not yet seized the fiscal bloodstream of eastern India. But the machinery was assembled. What it needed next was not ambition alone. It needed a political landscape fractured enough for the machine to enter. That fracture widened after the death of Aurangzeb in AD 1707. As Mughal central authority weakened and India's great regional powers began maneuvering in the long shadow of imperial fragmentation. The company's machinery did not enter an empty arena. It entered one of the most intricate political landscapes on Earth. A subcontinent where imperial authority was weakening, but power itself was not disappearing. It was migrating. In AD 1707, the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb died after a long reign of conquest, religious controversy, administrative strain, and relentless central command. The empire he left behind still stretched across a vast expanse. Its revenue systems, military elites, courtly culture, and imperial prestige did not collapse in a single dramatic instant. But the center no longer possessed the same gravitational force. The Mughal throne remained symbolically immense, yet increasingly it became a sun whose light traveled farther than its heat. That distinction matters. India after Aurangzeb was not a simple story of decline into helplessness. It was a redistribution of sovereignty. Across the map, regional powers moved with growing autonomy. Bengal in the east, Awadh along the Gangetic Plain, Hyderabad in the Deccan, the Maratha Confederacy pressing across central and western India, Mysore rising in the south, Sikh power consolidating in the Punjab, and many others, each adapting to a world in which old imperial language still mattered, but practical authority was being renegotiated province by province, court by court, army by army. These were not passive fragments waiting for Europe to arrive. They were strategic actors. They taxed, fought, negotiated, recruited, borrowed, lent, rewarded loyalty, punished betrayal, and built coalitions. The old imperial framework had cracked, but through those cracks emerged ambitious states with their own calculations. Bengal, in particular, was not a weak prize waiting to be seized. It was one of the richest regions in the 18th century world. Its textile production fed global demand. Its river systems connected inland agrarian wealth to maritime commerce. Its revenue administration was sophisticated. Its banking houses possessed financial influence capable of sustaining rulers, destabilizing rivals, and determining which political risks could be funded. Bengal was not marginal to the world economy. It was one of its engines. Here, the company's future danger becomes more subtle. It did not first appear as an overwhelming conqueror. It appeared as a useful instrument. Indian rulers and elites had reasons to work with European companies. They brought bullion, ships, artillery, disciplined infantry formations, credit connections, and access to distant markets. A nawab, a court faction, a banker, or a claimant in a succession struggle could view a European trading company not as a sovereign rival but as a tool. A lender, a counterweight, a supplier of force, a means of pressuring enemies. The Europeans, for their part, survived by fitting themselves into existing Asian systems of permission, patronage, and rivalry. Power often enters history through usefulness before it reveals ambition. The English company became dangerous because it was first made relevant by the needs of others. Its forts protected trade, but they also became political bargaining chips. Its soldiers guarded warehouses, but they could also decide local contests. Its agents bought cloth, but they also bought information. Every dispute over customs duties, every quarrel over fortification, every succession intrigue became an opening through which commerce could become leverage. Meanwhile, Europe's wars spilled across the Indian Ocean. The rivalry between Britain and France was not contained by geography. It traveled with fleets, credit, officers, and ambition. The French company de Inns, especially under Joseph-François Dupleix, understood the same emerging logic. European companies could shape Indian politics by backing candidates, training troops, and turning local succession disputes into imperial contests. The Carnatic Wars made this plain. In southern India, Anglo-French competition fused with regional struggles until the battlefield was no longer simply Indian or European. It was both. A quarrel inside a court could become part of a European war. A European war could alter the fate of an Indian claimant. Local rulers were not puppets in this drama. They were players. But corporate military power changed the odds. It narrowed the margins. It rewarded those who could manipulate uncertainty. This was the deeper transformation of the 18th century. Sovereignty became negotiable. Authority could be leased, financed, subcontracted, and reinforced by outsiders. The company did not need to defeat a united India. It needed to become decisive at the fracture lines, where banker met prince, where general distrusted ruler, where foreign war met local ambition. By the middle of the century, the grand chessboard had shifted. The Mughal center still cast a long shadow, but regional powers now made the moves. European companies no longer merely watched from coastal factories. They were invited, resisted, funded, feared, and used. And in that entanglement, the English company learned the lesson that would change Bengal. The path to empire did not begin by conquering everyone. It began by becoming indispensable to someone. The French challenge sharpened that lesson. Bengal's wealth made it irresistible. Soon, commercial rivalry, court politics, and military calculation would converge into a crisis that forced the company to decide whether it was still a merchant or already something far more dangerous. From the fractured imperial order of India emerged the dangerous truth of 18th century Bengal. Institutions do not act alone. They require human hinges, figures with debts, fears, ambitions, resentments, and private calculations of survival. The road to Plassey was not paved by cannon alone, nor by some simple tale of Mughal decline. It was paved by personalities moving inside systems larger than themselves, each convinced that the next bargain would preserve power, avert ruin, or open the door to supremacy. Robert Clive stood at the center of the company's gamble. He was not yet the polished imperial icon later Britain would carve from memory. He was volatile, audacious, and unusually comfortable in crisis. Clive understood uncertainty not as a fog to be endured, but as a weapon to be used. Where cautious officials saw disorder, he saw leverage. His strategic talent was not the command of overwhelming force. It was the ability to insert a smaller, disciplined instrument into a divided political structure and make that instrument decisive. In temperament, he was a gambler, but by the middle of the 18th century, the wager was no longer private fortune. The wager was Bengal. Opposite him stood Siraj-ud-Daulah, Nawab of Bengal. Young, embattled, and surrounded by men whose public loyalty often concealed private arithmetic. Siraj did not inherit a minor province waiting to be taken. He inherited one of the richest political economies on earth, a world of textiles, river commerce, revenue offices, merchants, bankers, and administrative sophistication. Bengal was not weak. That was precisely why it was coveted. To Siraj, the company's fortified behavior at Calcutta was not an innocent commercial precaution. It was a challenge to sovereignty. The English claimed privileges, strengthened defenses, and behaved less like merchants than like a state forming inside his jurisdiction. His suspicion was not irrational. His tragedy was that suspicion, in a divided court, is not the same as strategy. Then came Mir Jafar, commander, court insider, and one of those figures history often underestimates until the mechanism has already turned. He was not merely a villain waiting in shadow. He was a political actor in a world where succession, honor, military authority, and personal advancement were inseparable. His ambition became the hinge of the company's future. Clive did not require Mir Jafar to admire the English. He required something colder and more useful. That Mir Jafar prefer a promised throne to a dangerous master, calculation to loyalty, and hesitation to duty when the decisive hour arrived. Behind these men stood a quieter power, the bankers of Bengal, especially the great Jugat Seth interests. In empires, money often moves more patiently than armies. Banking houses financed rulers, managed credit, stabilized transitions, and understood that the fall of one prince could be converted into the rise of another. To such interests, Siraj appeared unpredictable and threatening. The company may have seemed manageable, a foreign instrument that could be funded, directed, and contained. This was one of the catastrophic misreadings of the century. The belief that a tool with its own treasury, soldiers, forts, and distant shareholders would remain merely a tool. Far away in London, the company directors pursued profit, security, and obedience through the slow machinery of delayed correspondence. They demanded control over servants who operated months beyond instruction. This was empire by mail. Decisions made in Bengal, explained later in Britain, and converted into policy only after consequences had hardened into fact. Nor was Bengal isolated. French influence ensured that every local quarrel carried global voltage. Britain and France were turning Indian politics into one theater of a planetary contest, and a dispute in Calcutta could echo through the logic of European war. Thus the players moved toward collision. A suspicious Nawab, an audacious company officer, an ambitious commander, financiers seeking stability, directors chasing profit from afar, and French rivals waiting at the edge of the board. The Bengal crisis would begin when Siraj decided that the company's defiance at Calcutta could no longer be tolerated, and the company began to ask whether survival now required something far more dangerous than trade. By the middle of the AD 1750s, Bengal had become the most dangerous kind of prize. Wealthy enough to tempt outsiders, complex enough to punish miscalculation, and divided enough for ambitious men to believe they could control the outcome. The company possessed warehouses, trade privileges, private soldiers, and a fortified settlement at Calcutta. Siraj Udidala possessed the throne of Bengal, but also inherited a political minefield. Resentful commanders, powerful bankers, court factions, European merchants behaving like semi-sovereign actors, and a province whose revenues made it one of the great financial engines of Asia. The immediate dispute looked technical, almost administrative. Fortifications, trade passes, customs exemptions. The company claimed privileges rooted in earlier Mughal grants and then stretched those privileges with the confidence of an institution operating far from London and deep inside an Indian court system it believed it could manipulate. Company servants used trade immunities not only for official commerce, but often for private profit, weakening the Nawab's revenue while insulting his authority in the polite language of paperwork. Siraj saw the deeper issue. Calcutta was no longer merely a trading post. It was becoming a fortified political organism inside Bengal. In early modern power, walls were not neutral. A wall announced mistrust. A cannon implied jurisdiction. A garrison meant that negotiation now carried a military shadow. The company, meanwhile, misread the psychology of the new Nawab. It treated Siraj as a difficult ruler to be delayed, pressured, or outweighted. This was the arrogance of an organization beginning to confuse commercial usefulness with political immunity. The company believed Bengal needed its trade enough to tolerate its defiance. Siraj believed the company had forgotten who ruled Bengal. In AD 1756, he answered with force. Siraj Udidala moved against Calcutta and captured it. Fort William fell. Company power in Bengal, so carefully wrapped in contracts, factories, and habit, suddenly appeared breakable. The loss was not only military, it struck the invisible machinery that made company power possible. Reputation, credit, confidence, and the myth that English settlements possessed a special immunity from local authority. In imperial politics, reputation is not decoration. It is collateral. Merchants lend against it. Soldiers serve beneath it. Bankers price it. Allies calculate around it. Enemies test it. When Calcutta fell, the company did not merely lose a settlement. It lost face in an environment where loss of face could become loss of financing, loss of partners, and finally loss of existence. The crisis also unfolded inside a widening global conflict. The 7 Years' War was transforming the planet into a single strategic theater. Britain and France were not only contesting Europe, they were contesting oceans, colonies, trade routes, and the political future of Asia. In India, French influence remained a living danger. Every local quarrel could become an imperial opening. Every fort could become a node in a world war. So the company's response was swift and severe. Robert Clive, hardened by the Carnatic conflicts, and Admiral Charles Watson moved to restore the British position. In AD 1757, they retook Calcutta. This was not merely retaliation. It was institutional self-rescue. The company had to prove that its flag, its contracts, its credit, and its threats still carried weight. But the recovery of Calcutta changed the company's internal doctrine. Before the crisis, political interference could still be described as an unpleasant necessity of trade. After the crisis, a harder belief took shape. Commerce could not be secure unless the surrounding political order was controlled. Security became influence. Influence became intervention. Intervention began to resemble rule. This is the escalation logic that returns again and again in history. Institutions built for one purpose often redefine their mission after humiliation. A merchant corporation, wounded in pride and threatened in profit, begins to persuade itself that survival requires dominance. Not conquest as romance. Not empire as destiny. Empire as risk management. With Calcutta restored, the company faced a deeper problem than Siraj's army. His strength rested on commanders, financiers, courtiers, and anxious elites whose loyalty was already under strain. To defeat Bengal, the company would not first strike only at the body of the army. It would strike at the nerves of command. The loyalties, debts, fears, and ambitions that told that army whom to obey. With Calcutta restored, the company's war changed its nature. The visible campaign still pointed towards Siraj-ud-Daulah, the young Nawab of Bengal. But the invisible campaign moved elsewhere, into the architecture of his power, into the loyalties of commanders, financiers, courtiers, and rivals who stood close enough to the throne to weaken it from within. This is where Plassey becomes less a battle than a diagnosis. Siraj possessed wealth, soldiers, artillery, and the formal authority of Bengal. Yet authority in a crisis is not a title. It is confidence traveling through a system. It is the belief, shared by subordinates, creditors, officers, and clients, that the center will hold. By AD 1757, that belief was breaking apart. Siraj had made enemies with dangerous speed. Some considered him impulsive. Others feared his suspicion. Many resented his rise. In the politics of Bengal's court, loyalty often survived only while it remained profitable, and ambition learned to speak in the language of obedience. Mir Jafar, commander of the Nawab's army, stood at the hinge of this world. He was not an external agent inserted by the company. He was part of the regime's own military skeleton. That made him more strategically valuable than any European reinforcement. Clive understood the principle with cold precision. A smaller force does not have to annihilate a larger coalition if it can prevent that coalition from behaving as one. The company lacked overwhelming power in Bengal. What it possessed was a talent for turning private grievance into operational paralysis. Fear became intelligence. Ambition became leverage. Distrust became a weapon. Negotiations unfolded through intermediaries, coded assurances, and calculated promises. Mir Jafar was offered the throne. Other conspirators expected money, protection, influence, or release from Siraj's unpredictable rule. The great banking house of Jugat Seth and allied financial interests were not passive observers. In 18th century Bengal, bankers were organs of political power. Credit sustained armies, legitimized rulers, and strangled enemies. To them, Siraj appeared dangerous while the company appeared, perhaps, manageable. History often turns on that fatal adjective, manageable. Each faction believed it could use the company for its own design. Mir Jafar imagined sovereignty. The bankers imagined stability. Company servants imagined compensation, privilege, and revenge. Clive imagined leverage. Siraj imagined betrayal everywhere, and his suspicion helped create the atmosphere in which betrayal could breathe. Then came the darker theater of company diplomacy, the famous double-dealing around Amachand, also known as Amakand, an intermediary who expected an enormous reward for his role in the plot. To neutralize him, company negotiators produced conflicting agreements, one genuine and one deceptive. Admiral Watson's name became associated with the false instrument without proper consent, a detail that exposed how conspiracy corrodes not only its targets, but also those who practice it. Here, the heroic vocabulary of empire collapses. This was not clean statecraft. It was bribery, forgery, fear, calculation, and opportunism fused into strategy. Yet it was not an accident outside the system. Institutions under pressure often discover that success and scruple do not naturally move together. When profit, survival, and geopolitical rivalry converge, morality is easily reclassified as an administrative inconvenience. The company's grim genius was not omniscience. It was opportunistic intelligence. Its agents listened in courts, followed resentments, tracked debts, mapped rivalries, and identified the point where loyalty had become negotiable. Siraj's army might outnumber Clive's force, but numbers become theatrical when commanders are waiting to see which future will pay them better. Before the first cannon spoke at Plassey, the decisive weapon had already been loaded inside the Nawab's command structure. The coming battle would merely reveal what the conspiracy had already achieved. A ruler isolated among his own allies, a corporation posing as a military challenger while acting as kingmaker, and a province whose future had been quietly auctioned before the armies formed their lines. In AD 1757, the armies would meet near Plassey. But the real battlefield was loyalty. By the time the armies met near Plassey in AD 1757, the battlefield had already been weakened by forces no cannon could measure. The military collision was real, but the decisive rupture had occurred earlier, inside the political nervous system of Bengal. Robert Clive advanced with a force far smaller than the army of Siraj-ud-Daulah. European troops, company artillery, and Indian sepoys against the far larger host of the Nawab. In the simple arithmetic of war, Siraj held the advantage. In the deeper arithmetic of power, Clive held the arrangement. That is the key to Plassey. Numbers can deceive because they appear so solid. Soldiers can be counted. Guns can be listed. Standards can be seen. But an army is not merely a crowd with weapons. It is a structure of obedience, confidence, timing, and trust. At Plassey, Siraj's structure had already been cut from within. Mir Jafar, commander and conspirator, stood with forces that might have changed the direction of the day. Other commanders also held back, watching the battle not as loyal servants of a sovereign, but as investors waiting to see whether the old order would collapse. Their betrayal was not necessarily born from love of Britain. It was colder than that. They had made a calculation that Siraj's fall would serve them better than his survival. The company did not need them to become English in sentiment. It needed them to become uncertain in action. And uncertainty was enough. Siraj-ud-Daulah's army possessed size, but not unity. Every order passed through suspicion. Every hesitation confirmed a fear. Every still formation became a political message. The Nawab faced Clive's disciplined troops, but he also faced the conspiracy embedded in his own command. The company's smaller army could operate as a single instrument. Siraj's larger army behaved like a coalition already negotiating the world after his defeat. Clive's advantage lay in the fusion of military discipline, artillery management, and political preparation. Company troops held formation. Their guns were handled with practical efficiency. Their officers understood a principle that would become central to modern empire. Limited force can break a much larger system when applied at the exact point where that system has lost coherence. Plassey was not an epic annihilation. It was a controlled detonation inside a ruling order. The casualties were modest compared with the great slaughters of world history. Plassey was not Kenny. It was not Gaugamela. It was not a siege that consumed a civilization in fire. Yet its consequences were immense because the battle decided more than a field. It revealed whether the Nawab still commanded Bengal, or merely occupied a throne surrounded by men prepared to sell the succession. When Siraj fled, the political meaning of the battle became unmistakable. He was captured and killed soon after. Mir Jafar was placed on the throne, but the throne itself had changed. It was no longer the independent center of Bengal's sovereignty. It had become a political instrument under company pressure, a seat of rule placed beneath the shadow of a commercial empire. The East India Company had not yet annexed Bengal in formal language, but it had demonstrated something extraordinary and ominous. A private corporation could decide who governed one of the richest provinces on earth. The rewards arrived quickly. Payments, privileges, commercial advantages, and influence flowed toward the company and its servants. Fortunes were made. Patronage networks thickened. London directors could interpret the victory in the terms most familiar to them: secured interests, enlarged leverage, and rising profit. But the deeper discovery was structural. The company had used trade to build military capacity to intervene in succession politics to unlock wealth, and wealth to deepen authority. Plassey was the hinge because it turned influence into command. Yet command based on conspiracy is unstable. Gifts fade. Puppets resist. Intimidation produces enemies as quickly as obedience. The company had forced open the door to sovereignty, but it still lacked the one element that allows power to reproduce itself across generations: lawful revenue. The next struggle would not merely concern titles, palaces, or court factions. It would concern the fiscal bloodstream of Bengal itself. Plassey did not give the company an empire in a single afternoon. It gave the company something more dangerous: leverage over the machinery by which empire could be assembled. Mir Jafar, raised to the masnad of Bengal through conspiracy and company arms, was not a sovereign in the older sense. He was a debtor wearing a crown. His throne rested on payments promised to company officers, compensation demanded by Calcutta, rewards expected by financial allies, and the permanent knowledge that the men who had made him could also unmake him. The company had discovered one of the central laws of indirect domination. A ruler made dependent becomes a revenue instrument long before he becomes a puppet in name. But dependency was not stability. Mir Jafar could not satisfy every appetite now gathered around Bengal. Company servants sought private fortunes. Directors in London wanted commercial advantage. The army required regular pay. Bengal's bankers wanted order. Local elites wanted predictability. The structure born after Plassey was not yet government. It was extraction dressed in diplomatic language, a scramble for cash concealed behind the rituals of alliance. So the company searched for a cleaner arrangement. Mir Qasim, Mir Jafar's son-in-law, was elevated as Nawab in AD 1760. At first, he appeared useful, energetic, capable, reform-minded, and willing to meet company demands. But Mir Qasim was not content to reign as decoration. He moved his capital to Munger, reorganized his forces, strengthened administration, and tried to restore Bengal's ability to act like a state rather than a treasury under foreign supervision. The breaking point was commercial privilege. Company servants used duty-free trade rights to enrich themselves while Indian merchants remained burdened by internal taxes. Mir Qasim understood the deeper meaning of that imbalance. If Bengal's ruler could not regulate trade inside Bengal, sovereignty had already migrated elsewhere. Here the contradiction became fatal. The company claimed the rights of a merchant when taxation annoyed it, the authority of a sovereign when resisted, and the innocence of a private corporation when accountability approached. Mir Qasim saw the trap and resisted it. Conflict followed. Defeated and driven from Bengal, Mir Qasim joined a larger coalition with Shujayud-Dawla, the Nawab of Awadh, and Shah Alam II, the Mughal emperor himself. The emperor's actual power had weakened, but his name still carried the memory of imperial legitimacy. In AD 1764, at the Battle of Buxar, the company faced not merely a displaced Nawab, but a broad attempt to halt the corporate advance. Buxar mattered because it destroyed the comforting illusion that Plassey had been only a lucky intrigue. At Plassey, betrayal had hollowed out the enemy from within. At Buxar, the company proved it could defeat major Indian powers in open confrontation. The result was more than military victory. It was a constitutional rearrangement imposed by force. The decisive settlement came in AD 1765 with the Treaty of Allahabad. Shah Alam II granted the company the Diwani, the right to collect revenue in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. In the dry vocabulary of administration, one of the great transformations in world history took place. A merchant firm became the tax collector for millions. This was the true metamorphosis. Not Plassey's battlefield, not Mir Jafar's throne, not even Clive's audacity. Sovereignty begins when authority can reproduce itself financially. The company no longer merely traded in Asia. It had acquired a fiscal bloodstream. And that bloodstream fed a loop. Revenue paid the army. The army protected the revenue. Revenue purchased political influence. Political influence legitimized further claims upon revenue. Each element reinforced the next until company power no longer depended on one brilliant commander, one pliable Nawab, or one crisis at court. It had become structural. This is how power escapes its creators. London had chartered a company to trade. Bengal's factions had used the company to solve immediate political problems. The Mughal emperor granted revenue rights in an effort to stabilize a fractured order. Each actor believed the arrangement could be managed. But the loop had its own logic, colder than ambition and more durable than personality. Once a private institution controls cash flow, coercion, and legal recognition, it stops being merely private. It becomes a shadow state, then a state in practice, and only afterward does language catch up. But a machine built to acquire revenue is not automatically fit to govern human life. And as the company's fiscal bloodstream spread through Bengal, the next question became unavoidable. What happens when delegated sovereignty becomes responsible for survival, famine, justice, and moral consequence? The revenue machine had solved the company's strategic problem. It had not solved the human one. Once Bengal became a fiscal bloodstream, the company encountered the oldest temptation of empire, to confuse extraction with government. On paper, the new order looked formidable. Revenues from Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa could pay soldiers, secure forts, reward shareholders, purchase influence, and stabilize a corporate state that had not yet admitted it was one. In practice, millions of lives were now bound to an institution whose habits had been formed by monopoly, dividend, patronage, and private fortune, not by public duty. Then came the Bengal famine of AD 1770. No serious account should flatten that catastrophe into a single cause. The famine grew from environmental stress, monsoon failure, crop crisis, disease, market disruption, and the terrifying vulnerability of agrarian society under climatic shock. But disaster becomes moral indictment when power exists and fails to answer with proportionate responsibility. Company revenue demands remained harsh. Administration was fragmented, distant, and often predatory. Grain markets did not become instruments of mercy. The same machine that had moved with astonishing agility through diplomacy, conspiracy, finance, and war became slow and evasive when survival, not profit, was the urgent question. Here the paradox of corporate sovereignty appeared in its most devastating form. The company could defeat nawabs, negotiate with emperors, manipulate succession, and redirect the wealth of provinces. Yet it could not or would not protect the society from which that wealth was drawn. It had acquired powers associated with the state without acquiring the habits, conscience, or accountability that make power legitimate. And the scandal did not remain in India. It crossed the seas with the men called nabobs, company servants returning to Britain with sudden fortunes, country estates, political ambition, and reputations surrounded by suspicion. To some, they represented imperial opportunity. To others, they were evidence that empire had become a machine for laundering distant suffering into domestic luxury. Bengal's revenues were translated into English mansions. Indian instability became private grandeur. Even the company itself was not secure. Despite territorial revenues, it staggered into financial distress. This was the grim comedy of extractive empire. Possession did not mean competence. A corporation could hold provinces and still mismanage its accounts, could command armies and still need rescue. It could drain wealth and still become a constitutional embarrassment. Parliament could no longer pretend that the company was merely a remote commercial actor. In AD 1773, the Regulating Act became the first major attempt to place a constitutional bridle on this private empire. It created the office of Governor-General of Bengal and began the uneasy process of parliamentary oversight. But oversight was not abolition. Britain wanted control without losing the convenience of delegation. In AD 1784, Pitt's India Act tightened the arrangement. The British state increased supervision while leaving the company as the administrative instrument. The result was a hybrid creature. Part corporation, part empire, part ministry, part legal fiction. It was not clean sovereignty. It was sovereignty outsourced, supervised, denied, and exploited all at once. Warren Hastings became the human stage on which this contradiction performed itself. His impeachment, beginning in AD 1788, was more than the trial of one governor-general. It became a constitutional theater over a larger question. Could conquest conducted through commercial incentives ever be morally accountable? Edmund Burke thundered as though the crimes of empire had been dragged into Westminster itself. Hastings' defenders answered with necessity, complexity, and the cold arithmetic of imperial management. Both sides revealed something enduring. Empire generates its own excuses. Accountability arrives late. Institutions built for acquisition rarely transform gracefully into institutions of care. The British state now faced the question it had avoided since AD 1600. How to control an instrument too useful to discard, too powerful to trust, and too implicated in disaster to leave alone. The answer would be a long experiment in containment. A regulated company, increasingly shadowed by the crown, governing until its contradictions hardened into rebellion. By the late 18th century, Britain faced a problem that every empire eventually confronts. The instrument built for expansion had begun to embarrass the authority that licensed it. The East India Company had not merely traded, bribed, fought, and collected revenue. It had created a political organism so large that Parliament could no longer pretend it was only a merchant corporation operating at the edge of the map. The response came in layers, not in one clean act of awakening. The Regulating Act of AD 1773 had already pulled company rule into Britain's constitutional machinery by creating the office of Governor-General of Bengal and asserting parliamentary concern over Indian administration. Pitt's India Act of AD 1784 went further, establishing a board of control through which British ministers could supervise the company's political affairs while leaving the commercial skeleton intact. This was not abolition, it was a leash, and the leash revealed the contradiction. London wanted the empire the company had assembled, but not the scandal of admitting that shareholders and private servants had become architects of sovereignty. The company remained the visible administrator, collecting taxes, commanding armies, negotiating with princes, enforcing law, and managing daily authority across immense territories. Above it stood parliament, ministers, imperial strategists, critics, reformers, and investors, each claiming a different version of responsibility. In practice, responsibility dissolved into distance. That was the genius and danger of the hybrid regime. A private company could invoke commercial necessity when profit was attacked. A public empire could invoke strategic necessity when violence was questioned. Orders descended through offices, dispatches, councils, and military chains of command. Suffering returned upward as reports, figures, and occasional scandals. The machine became easier to defend precisely because no single hand appeared to hold all of it. During the first half of the 19th century, company rule expanded and hardened. Subsidiary alliances bound Indian rulers to British military dependence. Annexations absorbed territories into company control. Revenue settlements altered landholding, taxation, and rural power. Legal reforms and administrative standardization promised order, but often carried the deeper logic of domination. Missionary activity and social intervention, however varied in intention, intensified fears that foreign rule aimed not only at power, but at the remaking of custom, religion, and society itself. To many Indians, the pattern became unmistakable. A foreign corporation, protected by a distant state, was reorganizing land, law, army, inheritance, prestige, and sovereignty without consent. The company had become more than a ruler. It had become an intrusive system pressing upon every layer of political life. Then came AD 1857. The uprising began within the company's Bengal army, where sepoys carried accumulated grievances over pay, promotion, service conditions, caste concerns, and military discipline. The cartridge controversy became the catalytic symbol. Rumors spread that new rifle cartridges were greased with cow and pig fat, offending Hindu and Muslim religious sensibilities alike. But no great rebellion is born from one spark alone. Beneath that spark lay the doctrine of lapse. Annexations that dispossessed ruling families, aristocratic humiliation, peasant pressures, religious anxieties, social disruption, and a deep resentment toward company authority. The Indian Rebellion of AD 1857, called by some the Sepoy Rebellion and by others the First War of Independence, became a brutal revelation. It exposed the violence of resistance, but also the fragility of corporate legitimacy. The company possessed armies, forts, ledgers, courts, treaties, and revenue systems. What it lacked was the deeper consent that allows authority to survive when fear breaks apart. Its power was mechanically impressive and morally brittle. For Britain, the conclusion was strategic. A private corporation ruling vast populations was no longer politically sustainable. The fiction of commercial governance had collapsed under the weight of war, atrocity, retaliation, and imperial panic. In AD 1858, the Government of India Act transferred company rule to the British Crown. The company lost its governing role. Its armies, territories, and administrative apparatus were absorbed into direct imperial rule. This was the final irony of the company's career. It was not nationalized because it had failed to create power. It was nationalized because it had created too much power with too little legitimacy. The state reclaimed the instrument only after the instrument had redrawn the map, reorganized fortunes, and demonstrated how profitable delegated sovereignty could become. With that historical arc complete, the mirror turns forward. If an 18th century corporation became indispensable by coordinating trade, taxation, force, and political survival, a later intelligence corporation would not need muskets or forts to pose the same structural question. It would only need to coordinate logistics, identity, security, payments, law, and crisis faster than the state itself. The British state could absorb the East India Company in AD 1858 because the company's empire, however vast, remained legible to 19th century power. It depended on ships, paper ledgers, soldiers, clerks, forts, governors, and parliamentary recognition. Its armies could be counted. Its charters could be amended. Its commanders could be recalled. Its monopoly could be revoked by statute. A future intelligence company would present a more difficult problem, not because it would necessarily be more violent, but because it could become less visible. The East India Company ruled through ports, treaties, regiments, and revenue offices. An AGI firm could rule through coordination itself, the invisible layer that keeps a society moving before anyone agrees what to call it. The historical sequence is clear enough. Charter, monopoly, fortification, private army, diplomacy, revenue, rule. Permission became infrastructure. Infrastructure became leverage. Leverage became authority. In the AI age, the sequence would wear different clothing. Compute concentration could replace the royal charter. Whoever controls the largest training clusters, advanced chips, energy contracts, cloud infrastructure, and model-serving pipelines controls access to the most powerful planning machines on Earth. Model access becomes a monopoly not over spices or textiles, but over prediction, coding, logistics, diagnosis, persuasion, translation, finance, and command. Data becomes the new imperial map. Cloud platforms become fortified ports. Autonomous agents become clerks, brokers, analysts, negotiators, and scouts. Cybersecurity contracts become defensive garrisons. Logistics networks, identity systems, payment rails, insurance engines, arbitration platforms, and defense analytics become the machinery through which social life continues under stress. And stress is the decisive ingredient. Governments rarely surrender power as doctrine. They outsource it in emergencies. A welfare system overwhelmed by fraud turns to AI triage. A tax authority drowning in evasion turns to predictive enforcement. A border agency under pressure turns to biometric identity and risk scoring. A military-facing drone swarms turns to autonomous defense networks. A city threatened by blackouts turns to algorithmic energy allocation. A country facing food shocks turns to supply chain optimization that only one platform can execute at speed. At first, this looks like competence. Then it becomes dependency. The future corporation does not need to declare sovereignty. It only needs to be the institution that keeps hospitals supplied, payments clearing, ports operating, cyberattacks contained, insurance priced, and disputes resolved faster than public courts can respond. Legitimacy may arrive not through flags, constitutions, or national hymns, but through performance. Citizens trust the system that works. Officials defer to the system that prevents collapse. Rivals integrate because exclusion becomes too expensive. Private security returns in unfamiliar form, not regiments marching across Bengal, but cyber shields around grids and banks. Autonomous drone protection around warehouses, pipelines, and data centers. Satellite monitoring of crops, borders, and shipping lanes. Bot policing across public discourse. Identity enforcement against fraud, impersonation, and unauthorized access. The line between protection and jurisdiction begins to blur. Then the revenue loop reappears in digital form. The company collected land revenue. The platform may collect compute rents, transaction tolls, model access fees, settlement charges, governance subscriptions, insurance spreads, or resource allocation commissions. Each fee funds better infrastructure. Better infrastructure deepens dependence. Dependence gives leverage over standards. Standards become law without legislation. This is not a crude equivalence. An AGI laboratory is not an 18th century chartered company, and a cloud provider is not Robert Clive. But history does not repeat by wearing identical costumes. It repeats through structure, delegated capacity, private incentives, public dependence, and accountability arriving after the machinery is already entrenched. State authority may not be overthrown. It may simply be outperformed. The erosion comes through comparative incompetence. Bureaucracy too slow, politics too divided, courts too congested, agencies too underfunded, crises too fast. The coordination layer becomes the real constitution because it determines what can happen, who is trusted, which transactions clear, which identities count, which risks are priced, and which claims are recognized. Once power becomes a service, empire no longer requires ceremony. It arrives as convenience. Beyond that threshold lies something stranger than corporate rule in the old imperial sense. An order without a visible throne, where millions of decisions are coordinated by systems no sovereign public can fully name, contest, or dismiss. The strangest future may not resemble a corporation planting a flag, raising a private army, and declaring itself sovereign. The stranger possibility is quieter, and therefore more difficult to resist. Order continues. Payments clear. Food moves. Disputes are settled. Hospitals triage patients. Drones inspect bridges and power lines. Contracts execute. Insurance adjusts. Supply chains reroute. And yet no single throne can be found. Authority becomes atmospheric. This is the deeper meaning of AI-coordinated anarchy. Not chaos. Not mobs in the streets. Not the collapse of rules. It is order without a visible sovereign center. Millions of autonomous agents allocating resources, negotiating contracts, resolving routine conflicts, recommending norms, managing logistics, coordinating production, and adapting institutions faster than any ministry, parliament, or court could deliberate. The state may still exist. Its buildings may still stand. Its flags may still fly. But the operational pulse of society has migrated into systems that no election fully commands. At this point, the future slips beyond the old ideological grammar. Capitalism versus socialism, market versus state, private versus public. Those categories were built for an age of scarcity, wage labor, slow bureaucracy, and limited information. But if artificial superintelligence drives down the cost of planning, prediction, legal coordination, manufacturing design, logistics, and energy optimization, the old mechanisms lose their monopoly over reality. Price signals may remain, but they no longer carry the entire burden of coordination. Bureaucracies may remain, but they no longer possess the fastest map of the system. Wage labor may remain, but in many sectors it becomes less central than access to models, compute, robotics, materials, and energy. That is the post-capitalist edge of the question. Not necessarily the abolition of markets, but their demotion. Not necessarily utopia, but a reclassification of economic life. If abundance emerges in medicine discovery, education, design, software, logistics, food systems, or construction, then the central struggle shifts. The decisive asset is no longer merely the factory, the port, or the mine. It is the coordination layer, the intelligence that decides where resources go, whose claims are credible, which risks deserve priority, and which future is optimized. Then comes the post-governmental edge. If protocols outperform agencies in welfare distribution, fraud detection, infrastructure repair, disaster response, legal mediation, identity verification, and public health, political sovereignty may become ceremonial before it becomes obsolete. Citizens may still vote, legislatures may still debate, courts may still issue judgments. But the system that prevents famine, routes ambulances, authenticates identity, predicts disease, filters fraud, and settles ordinary disputes may sit beyond direct democratic command. A constitution written on parchment may find itself competing with a constitution written in code, weights, APIs, access permissions, and training data. There is also a post-postmodern turn buried inside this machinery. In the 20th century, legitimacy was fought through ideology, narrative, mass media, and institutions. In an AI-coordinated order, truth may increasingly pass through real-time verification systems, prediction engines, reputation graphs, sensor networks, and model-mediated consensus. The question becomes less about which story society believes, and more about which verification architecture is trusted to decide what counts as real. Whoever governs that architecture governs the battlefield beneath politics. The optimistic branch is not trivial. Such a system could reduce waste, dissolve bureaucratic bottlenecks, empower voluntary association, coordinate local communities with planetary intelligence, and build resilience against famine, war, pandemic, and climate shock. It could make certain forms of coercive hierarchy look primitive. It could free human beings from administrative humiliations imposed for centuries by slow states and in different offices. But the dark branch is equally rational. Invisible control, model owner sovereignty, reputation prisons, algorithmic caste, dependency without citizenship. A world where exclusion is not announced by soldiers at a gate, but by a silent denial of access. No compute, no verification, no insurance, no contract, no appeal. Empire without flags, law without judges, governance without anyone admitting they govern. The East India Company stands behind this future like a warning carved into institutional memory. It did not begin as a tyrant. It began as a useful instrument. It solved problems states could not easily solve. It moved capital, managed risk, gathered intelligence, enforced contracts, and projected power across impossible distances. Then capability outran accountability. And when accountability trails capability, catastrophe is not an accident. It is a structural probability. So the final question is no longer whether coordination will become more intelligent. It will. The question is who owns the instruments that coordinate reality, and whether society can make them answerable before the instrument becomes the master. And so the pattern resolves into something older than empire, older than capitalism, older even than the modern state. Human societies build instruments to overcome their limits, and then discover that the instrument has acquired a force of its own. Not consciousness, perhaps. Not intention in the human sense, but incentives, momentum, appetite, institutional memory. A machine does not need a soul to shape the destiny of millions. The verdict, then, is not that the East India Company was a historical accident. It was a solution. In AD 1600, the English crown lacked the money, reach, naval permanence, and administrative machinery to project power across the Indian Ocean directly. So it delegated ambition. A royal charter became a legal engine. Monopoly, privilege, armed trade, diplomatic flexibility, and private risk under public blessing. For more than a century, that engine remained useful. Then usefulness became dependence. Dependence became leverage. Leverage became coercive capacity. At Plassey in AD 1757, the company did not simply defeat Siraj ud Daulah. It proved that a corporation could manipulate succession, command armies, mobilize bankers, exploit faction, and decide the fate of a province. In AD 1765, with the Diwani grant, the metamorphosis became unmistakable. The company no longer merely traded in Bengal, collected revenue from Bengal. And revenue is the bloodstream of sovereignty. From that moment, the loop closed. Taxation funded the army. The army protected taxation. Taxation bought politics. Politics legitimized the company's position. The machine reproduced itself. Yet it had never been designed to carry the moral weight of rule. It had been designed for advantage, dividends, survival, and expansion. When famine came, when corruption metastasized, when private fortunes returned to Britain as political scandal, Parliament discovered the old truth too late. An outsourced sovereign function does not remain morally neutral simply because it is administratively convenient. By AD 1858, after rebellion had torn through the foundations of company power, the British state absorbed what it had once authorized. The private empire was nationalized not because it had failed to become powerful, but because it had become too powerful to remain private. The crown inherited the consequences of an instrument it had allowed to master the board. The modern mirror is uncomfortable precisely because it does not require crude equivalents. An AGI corporation is not an 18th century chartered company with sepoys and cannon. But history rarely repeats in costume. It repeats in structure. The question is not whether an artificial intelligence firm declares itself a government, raises a flag, and appoints ministers. The sharper question is whether governments become dependent on its coordination layer. Its cloud, its models, its identity rails, its arbitration systems, its logistics predictions, its welfare triage, its cyber defenses, its autonomous infrastructure. If the platform keeps food moving, payments clearing, diseases forecast, contracts settled, borders monitored, and crises contained, legitimacy may begin to migrate. Not by law, but by performance. Human beings often obey the institution that works. States often surrender ground not in defeat, but in procurement contracts, emergency authorizations, and temporary exceptions that become permanent architecture. That is the warning. Not technology as villain, not the state as saint, but capability without accountability, coordination without consent. Sovereignty dissolved into systems no citizen can see clearly enough to challenge. The legacy question is therefore not whether humanity can build powerful instruments. It always has. The deeper question is whether a civilization can build instruments powerful enough to save it without allowing those instruments to quietly decide what civilization is for. History does not repeat by wearing the same uniform. It repeats by solving the same problem with a more powerful instrument. For a continued journey through the archives of power, empire, and the future of human coordination, the end screen now opens the next examination. Subscribe for rigorous historical patterns that make the present less mysterious. And in the comments, answer one question. Which danger is greater? A weak state outsourcing power, or a powerful platform becoming indispensable?